I found Margaret's letters last Tuesday while cleaning out the attic of the old Whitmore house. 64 years had passed since I last saw her handwriting, but I recognized it immediately. Those careful, slanted letters she'd practiced so diligently when we were children, back when she dreamed of becoming a school teacher, before life had other plans for her. The letters were tied with a faded blue ribbon, the same shade as the dress she wore that September morning in 1903 when Thomas Cartwright promised to return before the first snow. I was 16 then, Margaret's younger brother by 2 years, and I thought I understood everything about love and promises. Now, at 80, holding those letters in hands spotted with age and trembling with more than just the morning chill, I realize I understood nothing at all. But Margaret understood everything. She understood that some promises are meant to be kept, even when the one who made them can no longer remember why they mattered. She understood that waiting isn't passive, it's the most active thing a heart can do. And she understood, long before the rest of us, that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that end exactly as they were meant to end, even when that ending breaks every heart that witnesses it. The house is empty now, has been for 21 years since Margaret passed. But as I sit here in the parlor where she spent so many evenings with your needlework, watching the afternoon light slant through windows she cleaned every Saturday morning without fail, I can almost hear the echo of her humming, those Irish melodies our grandmother taught her, songs that seem to carry the weight of old sorrows and older hopes. The scent of lavender still lingers in the fabric of the curtain she sewed, and her tea service sits exactly where she left it, the delicate china cups still stained with the memory of countless afternoons spent waiting for news that never came. When I touch the lace doilies she crocheted during those long winter evenings, I can feel the pattern of her patience worked into every careful stitch.
The story begins, as all the best stories do, with an arrival. But to understand the magnitude of Thomas Cartwright's arrival in our small town of Millbrook, you must first understand what Millbrook was in the late summer of 1903. Our town sat like a comfortable old dog along the Albany and Northern Railway line, 47 miles south of the capital, and a world away from the rushing changes that were reshaping America at the dawn of the new century. Main Street stretched exactly 6 blocks from Murphy's livery stable at the south end to the whitewashed Methodist church at the north, with Father's General Store, Whitmore and Sons, though I wasn't quite old enough to deserve the plural, sitting right in the center like the heart of our small universe. The morning mist would roll off Miller's Creek behind the cemetery, carrying the scent of wild roses and damp earth through the streets lined with elm trees that had been saplings when my grandfather first settled in the valley. By 7 o'clock, smoke would begin curling from kitchen chimneys as housewives lit their stoves to prepare breakfast for husbands heading to work in the mills or the railroad switching station that employed half our men. The store was a wonderland of possibility in those days, its shelves lined with bolts of calico and wool, barrels of pickled cucumbers and salt pork, glass jars filled with peppermint sticks and horehound candy. The wide plank floors, worn smooth by decades of customers' boots, creaked in familiar patterns that told stories of commerce and community. The smell that greeted customers was a mixture of coffee beans and kerosene, leather goods, and the lavender sachets Mother tucked between the linens. It was the scent of lives lived simply, but with dignity, of dreams measured in small comforts and seasonal celebrations. Behind the counter, Margaret kept the books with the same meticulous care she brought to everything she touched. Her desk sat near the large front window where the morning light fell perfectly across her ledgers, and she had arranged it with the precision of someone who found beauty in order. A small vase usually held whatever flowers were blooming in Mother's garden: delphiniums in July, black-eyed Susans in August, late asters in September. A china cup, part of the set grandmother had brought from Ireland, held her pencils and the pearl-handled pen Father had given her for her 20th birthday. At 20, Margaret was considered by most to be approaching spinsterhood, a cruel judgment in a town where most girls married by 18. But Margaret had always been different, always reaching for something beyond what Millbrook could offer. She read voraciously, borrowing books from the traveling library that came through twice monthly, and spoke of attending the Teachers' College in Albany with a determination that made Mother fret about impractical dreams. Her reading had given her a vocabulary that sometimes surprised customers, and a way of looking at the world that went beyond the boundaries of our small town. She could discuss the poetry of William Wordsworth with the same ease that she calculated accounts receivable. And she had strong opinions about the women's suffrage movement that occasionally startled the older ladies who came in for fabric and gossip. "She's too particular," I'd heard Mrs. Henderson say to Mother after church one Sunday. "Turned down the Morrison boy and the banker's son from Gloversville? A girl can't wait forever for perfection to come calling." But Margaret wasn't waiting for perfection. She was waiting for something else entirely. Something she couldn't name until the morning Thomas Cartwright stepped off the 8:47 train from Albany, carrying nothing but a brown leather satchel and a letter of introduction from the regional railroad office.
I was sweeping the front steps of the store when the train pulled in, as was my habit on weekday mornings. The ritual had started years earlier when I was still small enough to be fascinated by the great iron beast that arrived punctually each day, breathing steam and carrying mysteries from the outside world. Even at 16, I found comfort in the routine. The distant whistle that announced the train's approach from the south, the gradual crescendo of iron wheels on steel rails, the satisfying conclusion as the locomotive ground to a halt with a final exhalation of steam. Most mornings, the platform remained empty except for the postal clerk who collected the mail sack and the conductor who consulted his pocket watch and called out the brief stop. Occasionally, a traveling salesman would emerge, blinking in the morning light and consulting a folded paper that invariably led him to our store or to the boarding house run by Mrs. Peterson on Elm Street. But that morning, September 3rd, 1903, a date I would remember with startling clarity for the rest of my life, a different kind of passenger stepped down from the second car. He was tall, but not unusually so, perhaps 5 feet 10 inches, with the kind of build that suggested physical work without the rough edges that came from purely manual labor. His dark hair refused to stay properly combed despite obvious recent efforts, and his clothes, a simple brown wool suit and white shirt, were clean but showed the wrinkles of overnight travel. What struck me most, though, were his eyes. They were the color of winter sky just before snow, clear and direct, but somehow gentle. They took in everything with a mixture of professional assessment and genuine curiosity, as if he were seeing not just a small railroad town, but the stories and possibilities contained within it. He paused on the platform, setting down his leather satchel to consult a folded piece of paper, then looked up and down Main Street with the careful attention of someone who wanted to understand the rhythm of a place before entering it. His gaze lingered on the church spire, the neat rows of houses with their front gardens still blooming despite the approach of autumn, and finally settled on our store with its painted sign and welcoming front porch. When he picked up his satchel and began walking towards us with purposeful strides, I had the distinct impression that something significant was about to happen, though I couldn't have said what or why. The morning air carried a hint of wood smoke and the last sweetness of summer flowers, and the elm trees cast long shadows across the dusty street. It was a perfectly ordinary September morning in Millbrook, and yet something about the approaching stranger made it feel like the opening chapter of a story I had been waiting my entire life to hear.
He paused in front of our store, consulting the paper once more, then looked up at the painted sign with a slight smile that transformed his serious face into something warmer and more approachable. When he pushed open the door, the brass bell attached to the frame chimed his arrival with the same cheerful note it had sounded for thousands of customers before him. From my position outside, I heard his voice for the first time, pleasant and educated, with just enough uncertainty to make him seem human despite his obvious confidence. Would this be Whitmore and Sons? Just Whitmore for now, came Father's voice from behind the counter, tinged with the dry humor he reserved for occasions when customers noticed the optimism in our store's name. But we're working on the Sons part. What can I do for you, young man? I abandoned my sweeping and crept closer to the door, not above a bit of eavesdropping when something interesting was happening. Through the window, I could see Father rising from his stool behind the counter, his reading spectacles still perched on his nose, and his account book still open to the morning's work. "Thomas Cartwright," the stranger said, extending his hand with the easy confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. "I have a letter here from the railroad office. I believe you're expecting me." Father accepted the letter and unfolded it with the careful attention he gave to all business correspondence. I watched his eyebrows rise slightly as he read, then saw the moment when professional interest gave way to genuine pleasure. "Harvest season inventory," Father said, looking up with a smile. "Yes, we've been expecting someone, though I'll admit I thought you'd be older. The work here can be demanding, especially during the busy season. I've been coordinating freight operations for the railroad for 8 years," Thomas replied, and I could hear the quiet pride in his voice, not boastful, but the legitimate satisfaction of a man who knew his craft. "I am accustomed to demanding work, Mr. Whitmore. If anything, I prefer it. Idle time has never suited me well." Father nodded approvingly.
He had little patience for laziness and considerable respect for anyone who took pride in honest labor. Good to hear. We'll be handling shipments of grain, preserved goods, and manufactured items from here to Albany and beyond. You'll need to coordinate with the railroad schedulers, manage our inventory levels, and help with the physical loading when necessary. All within my capabilities, Thomas assured him. When would you like me to begin? That's when Margaret looked up from her ledger.
She had been humming while she worked. Danny Boy, I think it was, one of those melodies that seemed to carry all the longing of the Irish countryside in its notes. The sound was so much a part of the store's morning atmosphere that I usually didn't notice it consciously, but it provided a gentle background to the business of commerce and community that filled our days. The humming stopped the moment Thomas spoke, and in the silence that followed, I witnessed something that I was too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize as significant. It was as if the very air in the store had changed its composition, become charged with an electricity that made every object seem more vivid, every sound more meaningful. Margaret's fingers, which had been moving steadily across the columns of figures in her ledger, went very still. Her pen remained poised above the page, a small drop of ink gathering at its tip, but her attention had shifted completely to the conversation taking place across the room. Thomas, who had been looking directly at Father while they talked, turned toward the source of the stopped humming with the instinctive response of someone drawn to beauty. When their eyes met, hers the deep brown of rich soil after rain, his that clear winter blue, the very quality of time seemed to shift. I have lived 80 years since that moment, have witnessed births and deaths and all the ordinary miracles that fill a human lifetime, but I have never again seen anything quite like what passed between Thomas Cartwright and my sister in those few seconds of silent recognition. It wasn't love at first sight. That phrase suggests something too simple for what actually occurred. It was recognition, as if they had been traveling toward each other across unknown distances for their entire lives and had finally arrived at the exact place and time where their paths were always meant to converge. "This is my daughter, Margaret," Father said, apparently oblivious to the small miracle occurring in his place of business. His voice carried the mixture of pride and protective concern that colored all his introductions of Margaret to young men. "She keeps our books and helps with customers. Most organized person you'll ever meet, and she knows every family in 3 counties. Thomas removed his hat, a simple brown felt that matched his suit, and stepped toward Margaret's desk with the careful respect due to a lady. The movement brought him into the shaft of morning sunlight that fell through the front window, and for a moment he seemed to glow with an internal light that made him appear almost ethereal. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been present when he spoke to Father. "It's a genuine pleasure to make your acquaintance." Margaret rose from her chair with the fluid grace that characterized all her movements, her dark skirt rustling softly against the wooden desk. The morning light caught the copper highlights in her brown hair and illuminated the small silver locket she wore, grandmother's locket, the one piece of jewelry she wore every day without fail. "Mr. Cartwright," she replied, her voice steady but softer than usual, as if she were afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell that seemed to have settled over the store. "Welcome to Millbrook. I hope you'll find our town agreeable during your stay."
The formal words were perfectly proper, exactly what was expected in such an introduction, but they were delivered with an undercurrent of something deeper. Curiosity, perhaps? Or the kind of careful attention one gives to something precious that might easily be damaged by careless handling. I would learn later, much later, when Margaret was old enough to speak freely about such things, that she felt as if she'd been holding her breath her entire life and had only just remembered how to breathe. Thomas, for his part, would confide to me weeks later that he heard something in Margaret's voice, a quality he described as like finding a warm room after walking through snow, that made him want to hear her speak again and again for the rest of his life. But in that moment, standing in the doorway of my family's store, with the September morning unfolding around us in all its ordinary beauty, all I knew was that something fundamental had changed. The casual Tuesday morning had become extraordinary, and I had witnessed the precise instant when it happened. Father, bless his practical soul, was more interested in completing business arrangements than in contemplating the mysteries of human attraction. "Margaret can show you around the store, explain our systems," he said, already turning back to his account book. "We'll start you off slowly, let you get familiar with our methods before the busy season really begins." Thomas nodded, but didn't take his eyes off Margaret. I would be grateful for any guidance Miss Whitmore might provide. Margaret smoothed her skirts with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Of course. Would you like to begin with the inventory system, or would you prefer to see the storage areas first?" "Whatever you think best," Thomas replied. And there was something in the way he said it, a complete trust in her judgment, a willingness to be led wherever she thought appropriate, that suggested he would have been content to follow her anywhere, even if she had proposed showing him the moon.
Thomas proved himself invaluable from his very first day, though his value extended far beyond the specific skills mentioned in his letter of introduction. Father had expected someone who could count inventory and write neat reports, but Thomas brought an understanding of commerce that transformed how we thought about the store itself. He noticed, for instance, that certain items sold better when displayed near the window where passing customers could see them. He suggested arrangements that encouraged customers to linger and examine additional goods, placing the penny candy near the fabric counter, where mothers might be tempted to buy treats for children who had been patient during fabric selection, or positioning the small household tools near the entrance, where men could examine them while their wives discussed purchases with Margaret. More than that, he had an intuitive grasp of people that allowed him to predict what would be in high demand as the seasons changed. In mid-September, when most of us were still thinking about the final harvest, Thomas was already suggesting that we increase our orders of lamp oil and warm clothing. "Winter comes early in upstate New York," he explained to Father one morning as they reviewed supplier catalogs. "People wait until the first cold snap to start thinking about winter preparations, but by then it's often too late to get the best prices or the full selection they need." But it was his treatment of customers that truly set Thomas apart. He treated everyone, from the wealthiest farmer to the poorest widow, with the same courteous attention. I watched him spend 10 minutes helping old Mrs. Patterson select the right gauge of knitting needles, never showing impatience even when a line of other customers waited behind her. He would crouch down to speak to small children at their eye level,
asking their opinions about penny candy selections as if their preferences were matters of great importance. With the men, he could discuss railroad operations, crop yields, and the mechanical problems of farm equipment with the easy competence of someone who had worked with his hands. With the women, he showed genuine interest in domestic concerns, the best methods for preserving autumn vegetables, the relative merits of different fabric weights for winter clothing, the challenges of maintaining household harmony when money was tight. But it was with Margaret that Thomas truly came alive. Their conversations began, properly enough, with business matters. Thomas would ask about the bookkeeping system, requesting information about regular customers' preferences and seasonal buying patterns. Margaret would respond with her usual efficiency, pointing out fluctuations in the sales figures or explaining the local customs that affected which goods we stocked and when.
"The Millers always buy their winter flour in October," she might say, showing him the pattern in her carefully maintained records. "Mrs. Miller insists it stays fresher if purchased before the really cold weather sets in. The Hendersons, on the other hand, wait until November and buy in smaller quantities. They say flour gets expensive too quickly if you buy too much at once." Thomas would nod thoughtfully, sometimes asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he understood not just the practical aspects of the information, but its human dimensions as well. "Are the Millers in better financial circumstances?" he might ask, "or do they have different priorities about how they manage their household expenses?" These practical exchanges gradually lengthened, growing to include observations about the weather, or comments about books Margaret was reading, or Thomas's stories about places he'd worked in his 8 years with the railroad. I began to notice that Thomas would find excuses to walk past Margaret's desk even when his work didn't require it, and that Margaret's humming would resume whenever Thomas was in the store, as if his presence gave her a reason to express the joy she carried inside her. The change in Margaret was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew her well. She began taking extra care with her appearance, pinning her dark hair in styles that showed off the elegant line of her neck. She started wearing her Sunday dress to work more often and began bringing flowers from Mother's garden to brighten her desk. The simple china vase that held her pencils now also held whatever blooms were most beautiful that day, late roses when they were available, or sprigs of goldenrod and wild asters when the garden flowers had faded. Most tellingly, Margaret began staying later at the store, finding additional tasks that needed completion, tasks that somehow always required assistance from our temporary employee. She would discover that the shelves needed rearranging, or that inventory needed to be recounted, or that the window display required updating. All work that, coincidentally, was best accomplished when 2 people could collaborate. I was too young then to understand the delicate dance of courtship, but I was old enough to recognize happiness when I saw it. And Margaret, in those golden weeks of late August and early September, was happier than I had ever seen her. Her laughter came more easily, her step was lighter, and she moved through her daily routines with an energy that seemed to light up everything around her. One evening in mid-September, as we walked home from the store together, Margaret surprised me by asking what I thought of Thomas Cartwright. He seems like a good man," I replied carefully, not sure how much of my observations I should share. "Father likes him, and he's certainly knowledgeable about railroad work." Margaret nodded, but I could tell she was hoping for something more specific. Do you think he'll stay in Millbrook after the harvest season ends?" The question revealed so much about the direction of her thoughts
that I felt a sudden protective concern for my sister. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Railroad work takes men to different places, but he seems to like it here." "Yes," Margaret said quietly, "he does seem to like it here." We walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, our footsteps echoing off the wooden sidewalks that connected the commercial district to our residential neighborhood. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke from kitchen stoves and the sweet fragrance of late-blooming roses that climbed the fences of the houses we passed. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "a person can feel as if they've been waiting their entire life for something without knowing what they were waiting for, and then suddenly they know." I was 16 years old, more interested in fishing and baseball than in the mysteries of the human heart, but even I understood that my sister had just shared something profound about her feelings for Thomas Cartwright. The knowledge carried with it a weight of responsibility that I wasn't sure I was ready to bear. The understanding that Margaret's happiness had become tied to forces beyond her control, to the decisions of a man who might or might not choose to make his temporary stay in Millbrook permanent. The evening walks began the following week, emerging as naturally as flowers bloom in spring. Every few days, after the store closed and supper was finished, Margaret would announce some errand that required her attention, returning a borrowed book to Mrs. Morrison, delivering soup to Mrs. Patterson, who had taken ill, or checking on the church flowers that were her responsibility as a member of the altar guild. And somehow Thomas would appear at our front gate just as she was leaving, offering his escort for safety's sake in the growing autumn darkness. It was a transparent arrangement that fooled no one, but it was also perfectly proper. A young woman shouldn't walk alone after dark, and a gentleman should offer protection when available. These walks lasted longer each time, evolving from simple circuits of the town's main streets to extended explorations of the countryside beyond Millbrook's borders. They would follow Miller's Creek that ran behind the cemetery, walking along its banks where the willows grew thick and the water ran clear over smooth stones polished by decades of current. Sometimes they would climb the small hill north of town where the foundation of a long-burned farmhouse offered a place to sit and watch the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. I followed them on several of these excursions, maintaining what I thought was a discreet distance, but probably obvious to anyone who bothered to look for a 16-year-old boy hiding behind trees and fence posts. My curiosity was stronger than my respect for their privacy, and I justified my spying by telling myself I was protecting Margaret's reputation, though what I really wanted was to witness the unfolding of the most romantic story I had ever encountered in real life. Their conversations, when the wind carried fragments to my hiding spots, revealed a compatibility that went far beyond physical attraction. Thomas spoke of cities he had visited during his railroad years, describing not just their size or commercial importance, but the character of their people, the architecture that revealed their values, the small details that made each place unique. "Buffalo is all business and ambition," I heard him tell Margaret one evening as they sat on a fallen log beside the creek. everything is about moving goods faster, making money quicker, building bigger and taller. There's energy there, but not much peace. Albany has more dignity. It remembers that it's the state capital and carries itself accordingly. But sometimes dignity can become stiffness, and stiffness can become coldness.
Margaret, in turn, shared her dreams of teaching, her love of literature, and her observations about human nature gleaned from years of serving customers in the store. She had opinions about the books she read, thoughts about the education of children, and ideas about the kind of community she wanted to live in. "I think a good teacher should be like a gardener," she told Thomas during one of their walks along the creek. "You don't force plants to grow in ways that go against their nature, but you provide the right conditions: good soil, adequate water, proper sunlight, and then you have faith that growth will occur naturally." Thomas listened to these conversations with the attention most people reserved for matters of great importance. He asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he had been thinking about her words, and he offered his own thoughts with the respectful tone of someone who valued her intelligence as much as her beauty. On one particularly clear evening in late September, I crept close enough to hear an exchange that revealed the depth of feeling that was developing between them. "I've always wondered what it would be like to see the ocean," Margaret was saying as they sat on the stone foundation that remained of the old farmhouse, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "The Atlantic coast near Portland, Maine," Thomas replied without hesitation. "That's where I'd take you first. The lighthouse there sits on rocks that have been shaped by centuries of storms, and when the fog rolls in at sunset, it's like watching the world dissolve and reform itself. The wildness of it would appeal to your love of literature, but there's also a peace there that would suit your contemplative nature." "You speak as if you're certain we'll travel together someday," Margaret said, "and even from my hiding place behind an old apple tree, I could hear the mixture of hope and uncertainty in her voice." The pause that followed was so long, I began to worry that they had discovered my presence and were waiting for me to reveal myself. But finally, Thomas spoke, his words carrying the weight of a man who had given serious thought to the future. "I've been in railroad work for 8 years, Margaret. I've seen a lot of towns, met a lot of people, lived in boarding houses from here to Chicago, but I've never met anyone who made me want to stop traveling. Until now." The silence that followed was different from the earlier pause, not uncertain, but full of possibility. When Margaret finally responded, her voice was soft but clear. "And I've never met anyone who made me want to leave Millbrook until now." It was a conversation that changed everything, though I wouldn't fully understand its significance until years later. In those few quiet words, Thomas and Margaret had acknowledged that their feelings went beyond casual attraction.
that they were contemplating a future together that would require changes and sacrifices from both of them. It was during the 3rd week of September that Thomas gave Margaret the locket. I didn't witness the actual exchange. Some moments are too private, even for the most determined spy. But I saw its aftermath, and Margaret's reaction told me everything I needed to know about the significance of the gift. She was sitting at her desk in the store the morning after, her fingers repeatedly touching her throat where a silver chain disappeared beneath the collar of her dress. Her usual morning efficiency had been replaced by a dreamy distraction that made her miscalculate simple sums and forget to record transactions in her ledger. Father, who prided himself on the accuracy of his records, had to correct her work twice before 10 o'clock. "You're going to bankrupt us if you keep adding numbers like that," I teased during a lull between customers, though I was more concerned than amused by the depth of her distraction. Margaret looked up from her ledger with startled eyes, as if she'd forgotten where she was or why she was holding a pen. Then she smiled, not her usual pleasant expression, but something deeper and more radiant that seemed to come from some internal source of joy I had never seen before. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying a dreamlike quality. "I seem to be having trouble concentrating this morning." "Does that have anything to do with whatever you're hiding under your collar?" I asked, with the directness that only younger brothers can manage without causing offense. Margaret's hand flew to her throat, and for a moment I thought she might deny wearing anything unusual. Instead, she glanced around to ensure we were alone in the store, then carefully drew out the silver locket. It was beautiful in its simplicity, about the size of a silver dollar, engraved with a delicate pattern of oak leaves that caught the light from the store's front windows. The silver had the soft glow of a piece that had been treasured and handled carefully over years of wear, and the craftsmanship was of a quality that spoke of genuine value and careful preservation. "It was his mother's," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "She died when Thomas was 12, and he's been carrying it ever since, waiting for—" She paused, color rising in her cheeks as she seemed to realize the implications of what she was about to say. "Waiting for the right person to give it to," I finished, understanding immediately the weight of such a gift. Margaret nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, though her smile never wavered. "He said he knew the moment he heard me humming that first day. He said some things just feel right, like they were always meant to be, like all the events of a person's life had been leading to that one perfect moment." I was 16 years old, more interested in fishing and baseball than in romance, but even I understood that Thomas Cartwright had just declared his intentions as clearly as if he'd taken out an advertisement in the county newspaper. The locket wasn't just a gift. It was a promise, a claim, a statement of possession that every woman in Millbrook would understand the moment she saw it gleaming at Margaret's throat. More than that, it represented Thomas's most precious possession, the one tangible connection he maintained to his deceased mother. For him to give it to Margaret meant that he had decided she was worthy of inheriting not just his affection, but his family history, his deepest emotional connections, his most carefully guarded memories. "What will you do?" I asked, though I could see from her expression that the decision had already been made. "I'll treasure it," Margaret said simply.
and I'll try to be worthy of the trust it represents." She tucked the locket back beneath her dress, but throughout the rest of the day I noticed her unconsciously touching the spot where it rested against her heart. Customers who had known Margaret for years commented on her unusually bright mood, and several of the older women exchanged knowing glances that suggested they recognized the signs of a woman in love. The last weeks of September passed in a golden haze of happiness that seemed too perfect to last. Thomas had integrated himself so seamlessly into our family's routine that it was hard to remember what our evenings had been like before his arrival. He helped me with my mathematics homework, displaying a patience that father sometimes lacked, and an ability to explain complex concepts in terms that made them seem not just understandable, but interesting. He assisted mother with heavy tasks around the house, moving furniture for her autumn cleaning and carrying buckets of water from the well without being asked. When the pump in our kitchen began making worrying sounds, Thomas spent an entire Saturday afternoon taking it apart, cleaning the components, and reassembling it so that it worked better than it had in months. Most importantly, he treated Margaret with a combination of respect and adoration that made her bloom like a flower finally receiving adequate sunlight. He listened to her opinions as if they were valuable counsel, asked for her thoughts on matters both trivial and important, and never failed to express appreciation for her intelligence as well as her beauty.
But underneath the happiness, I began to sense a growing tension. Father had begun making pointed comments about the temporary nature of railroad assignments, usually during dinner conversations when Thomas was present. Mother worried aloud about the approaching end of harvest season and what it would mean for Thomas's employment with us. Most significantly, Thomas himself seemed to be wrestling with decisions that weighed heavily on his mind. I noticed him writing letters in the evening, seated at the small desk in his room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. Through the window that faced our house, I could see the lamplight burning late into the night as he worked over his correspondence with unusual intensity. He would write for long periods, then stop and stare out the window toward our house, then return to his writing with renewed purpose. I saw him studying train schedules with more attention than his current work required, spreading the papers across Mrs. Peterson's kitchen table, and making notes in the margins with a pencil that he frequently tapped against his teeth while thinking. I caught him in several conversations with Mr. Williams, the station master, about routes and connections to distant cities, discussions that seemed to involve more than casual curiosity about railroad operations. Margaret noticed these things too, though she tried to hide her concerns behind her usual composed exterior. Her happiness remained, but it took on a fragile quality, like something beautiful but temporary that must be enjoyed fully while it lasted. I would catch her watching Thomas during dinner, her eyes taking in every detail of his face as if she were trying to memorize it. When he spoke about his work or his experiences with the railroad, she listened with an intensity that went beyond mere interest. One evening in late September, as we sat on the front porch after supper, Margaret asked Thomas directly about his plans after the harvest season ended. "The railroad has other assignments available," Thomas replied carefully. "There's always work for someone willing to travel, to adapt to different situations and requirements." "And do you enjoy the traveling?"
Margaret asked, her voice steady, but her hands betraying her nervousness as she smoothed her skirts repeatedly. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the darkening street, where lamplight was beginning to appear in windows along the row of comfortable houses. "I used to," he said finally. "The excitement of new places, new challenges, the satisfaction of solving different kinds of problems. But lately, I've been thinking that there might be something to be said for staying in one place long enough to really understand it, to become part of a community rather than just passing through."
It was the closest he had come to discussing his feelings about Millbrook, about the possibility of making his temporary stay permanent. And Margaret received his words with the careful attention of someone listening for meanings beyond the surface. "Some people are natural wanderers," she replied diplomatically. "Others are meant to put down roots, to find their place in the world and cultivate it carefully over time. I suppose the art is in knowing which type of person you truly are." Thomas was quiet for so long that Margaret began to worry she had said something wrong. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke from kitchen chimneys and the last sweetness of honeysuckle that climbed the fence behind their house. A barn owl called somewhere in the distance, its hollow note echoing across the valley like a question waiting for an answer. "I used to think I was the wandering type," Thomas said finally, his voice thoughtful and measured. 8 years of moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to form real attachments. I told myself it was freedom, that independence was worth more than the comfort of familiar faces and known streets. He turned to look at Margaret then, and in the fading light, she could see something in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. But these past weeks in Millbrook have shown me that I might have been wrong about my own nature. Sometimes a person doesn't know what home feels like until they find themselves in a place where they never want to leave. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from pleasure or embarrassment she couldn't say. The conversation had ventured into territory that seemed both thrilling and dangerous, full of implications that neither of them had yet voiced directly. "And what would it take," she asked carefully, "for someone like you to consider putting down those roots you mentioned?" Thomas smiled then, and Margaret thought it was the most beautiful expression she had ever seen on a human face. Equal parts hope and determination, tinged with just enough uncertainty to make him seem wonderfully, endearingly human. "The right reason," he said simply. "The right place. The right—" He paused, his eyes never leaving her face. "The right person to share it with." They walked home in comfortable silence after that, their footsteps echoing in harmony on the wooden sidewalks, their shadows stretching long in the lamplight from the houses they passed. Margaret felt as if she were floating slightly above the familiar streets, as if the ordinary Tuesday evening had been transformed into something magical by the weight of words spoken and unspoken between them.
That night, Margaret lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while moonlight filtered through the lace curtains she had sewn the previous winter. Her mind replayed every word of their conversation, analyzing each pause and emphasis for hidden meanings. The silver locket lay warm against her throat, and she found herself touching it repeatedly, as if it were a talisman that could make her impossible dreams come true. From the room next door, she could hear Mother moving about, preparing for sleep with the familiar sounds that had comforted Margaret since childhood. The soft brush of hairpins being placed on the wooden dresser, the gentle creak of floorboards worn smooth by decades of nightly routines, the whispered prayers that Mother thought no one else could hear. But tonight, even these comforting sounds couldn't quiet the restless energy that coursed through Margaret's veins. She felt as if she were standing at the edge of a great precipice, looking down into a future that was both terrifying and wonderful in its vast, unknown possibilities. Thomas Cartwright had not quite declared his intentions, but he had come close enough that Margaret could see the shape of what he might be preparing to offer her. The thought should have brought her nothing but joy, but instead it filled her with a complex mixture of elation and anxiety. She had spent 4 years preparing herself to be a teacher, 4 years dreaming of the independence and purpose that profession would provide. Now, suddenly, she was contemplating a future that might take her in an entirely different direction, toward marriage and domesticity, toward the traditional path that most women of her generation followed without question.
But it wouldn't be just any marriage, she reminded herself. It would be marriage to Thomas Cartwright, whose clear blue eyes had seen 6 states, who spoke to her as if her thoughts mattered as much as her appearance, who listened to her opinions about literature and politics with the same attention other men reserved for discussions of weather and commerce. The next morning brought an Indian summer day of unusual warmth and clarity, as if nature were offering one final gift before surrendering completely to autumn's advance. Margaret woke with unusual energy, dressing with extra care in her second-best dress, a soft green cotton that Mother said brought out the color of her eyes, and pinning her hair in a style that required 20 minutes of careful work, but made her feel polished and confident. At breakfast, Father commented on her unusual brightness. "You seem particularly cheerful this morning, daughter. Any special reason?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as she buttered her bread with careful attention. "It's such a beautiful day. Sometimes good weather is reason enough for good spirits." But Mother, who possessed the intuitive understanding of female moods that comes from 30 years of marriage and motherhood, gave Margaret a knowing look that suggested she suspected deeper causes for her daughter's radiance. "Indeed," she said mildly, "though I notice you've been particularly cheerful ever since a certain young railroad man arrived in our town." "Mother," Margaret protested, but she was smiling as she said it, unable to maintain even the pretense of offense. Father looked up from his newspaper with the expression of a man who has suddenly realized that important conversations have been taking place without his knowledge. "Railroad man? Are you referring to young Cartwright?" "Thomas has been nothing but perfectly proper," Margaret said quickly, though she could hear the defensive note in her own voice. "We've simply had occasion to discuss business matters, and he's proven to be an interesting conversationalist." "Interesting enough that you've taken to wearing your Sunday dress on Wednesday mornings?" Mother observed with gentle amusement. Margaret opened her mouth to deny any connection between her wardrobe choices and Thomas's presence in their lives, but the words died unspoken as she realized how transparent her feelings must be to anyone who cared to look. Instead, she laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to fill the small kitchen with sunshine. "Perhaps I have developed a certain appreciation for interesting conversation."
Father folded his newspaper with the deliberate movements of a man preparing to deliver important guidance. "Margaret, you know I hold young Cartwright in high regard. He's proven himself to be honest, hard-working, and respectful in all his dealings with our family. But you must remember that his position here is temporary. Railroad men lead uncertain lives, moving from place to place as their work requires." "I know, Papa," Margaret said softly, her joy dimming slightly as reality intruded on her morning happiness. "That doesn't mean," Father continued, his voice gentler now, "that temporary relationships can't have lasting value. But it does mean that you should be careful not to invest more of your heart than you can afford to lose." Margaret nodded, understanding the wisdom in her father's words, even as she felt her rebellious heart rejecting the caution they contained. How could she explain that it was already too late for such careful calculations? That Thomas Cartwright had already claimed territory in her heart that she feared she would never be able to reclaim, regardless of what the future might bring?
The following weeks brought a series of moments that seemed designed to test Margaret's ability to maintain the composure expected of a respectable young woman. There was the afternoon when Thomas stayed late to help her reorganize the store's back room, and their hands brushed while reaching for the same box of inventory cards. The contact lasted only a second, but Margaret felt electricity shoot up her arm, as if she had touched lightning itself. There was the evening when they encountered each other outside the post office, both having walked there separately on errands, and ended up sharing the walk home in companionable conversation about the books they had each been reading. Thomas had borrowed a volume of Wordsworth's poetry from the traveling library, and Margaret found herself quoting passages from memory, her voice taking on the rhythm of verse in a way that made even familiar words sound new and significant. "She was a phantom of delight," Thomas quoted softly as they paused at her front gate. "When first she gleamed upon my sight, a lovely apparition, sent to be a moment's ornament." Margaret felt her breath catch, recognizing the poem, but hearing it now with new meaning. But the poet goes on to say that the phantom becomes something more substantial, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "A perfect woman, nobly planned, to warn, to comfort, and command." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap on his skin and see the way the evening light caught the fine lines around his eyes. Perhaps Wordsworth understood something important about the difference between first impressions and deeper knowledge. Perhaps he did, Margaret agreed, and the words seemed to carry weight far beyond their literal meaning. Most significant of all was the Sunday afternoon when Thomas joined the family for dinner after church, and conversation turned to the subject of travel and distant places. Mother had prepared her finest meal, roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, creamed spinach from her own garden, and apple pie made from fruit picked that very morning from the tree behind her kitchen. "I've always wondered what the ocean looks like," Margaret mentioned during a lull in conversation, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "The books I've read describe it, but I suspect the reality must be quite different from even the most detailed descriptions." Thomas set down his water glass with careful attention, as if the simple action required his full concentration. "I've seen the Atlantic from the docks in Boston," he said thoughtfully. "The first thing that strikes you is the sound, not just the crash of waves against the pier, but the constant underlying whisper of water moving against sand, like a conversation that never ends."
"And the smell?" Margaret asked, leaning forward slightly with genuine curiosity. Salt, of course, but also something else, something clean and wild that makes you understand why sailors speak of the sea calling to them. Standing there, watching ships disappear over the horizon, you feel both very small and very connected to something vast and eternal. Father nodded approvingly. "Well put, young man. I've always thought that a person who can describe things clearly has usually taken the time to observe them carefully." But Mother was watching the interaction between Thomas and Margaret with the sharp attention of someone who recognizes the signs of a conversation that is about more than its apparent subject. When Thomas spoke of distant places, Margaret listened as if he were describing a country she desperately wanted to visit. When Margaret asked questions, Thomas answered as if her curiosity were the most important thing in the world. "Perhaps someday you'll have the opportunity to see the ocean for yourself," Thomas said to Margaret, and something in his tone suggested that he was offering more than just polite encouragement. "Perhaps I will," Margaret replied, her eyes never leaving his face, and the words carried the weight of possibility and promise. By the third week of October, the reality of Thomas's impending departure had begun to cast a shadow over their interactions, though neither of them spoke of it directly. The seasonal inventory was nearing completion, and everyone in Millbrook understood that the end of harvest work would mean the end of Thomas Cartwright's employment with Whitmore and Sons. Margaret found herself paying attention to small details with the intensity of someone trying to memorize a beloved face before a long separation. She noticed the way Thomas's hair fell across his forehead when he concentrated on his work, the precise movements of his hands as he counted inventory, the half-smile that appeared when he caught her watching him. She also noticed the changes in his behavior that suggested he was struggling with the same awareness of impending separation. He lingered longer over conversations that should have been brief. He found excuses to walk past her desk throughout the day, sometimes pausing to comment on her work or ask questions that seemed designed more to hear her voice than to gain information. Most tellingly, she caught him several times staring out the store's front window with an expression of such concentrated thought that she wondered if he were trying to memorize the view of Main Street the way she was trying to memorize everything about him. One evening, as they walked their familiar route through the elm-lined streets, Thomas surprised her by pulling a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket. "I've written to the railroad office in Albany," he said, without preamble, his voice carrying an unusual note of nervousness. "They have a position available, permanent position, coordinating freight operations between here and the capital. The pay wouldn't be as good as what they're offering me in Chicago, but it would allow me to stay in this area indefinitely." Margaret felt her heart begin to race, though she tried to keep her expression composed. "And have you decided whether to accept it?" Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her directly, his clear blue eyes serious in the lamplight from a nearby house. "That depends on whether I have sufficient reason to want to stay in this area indefinitely." The words hung in the evening air between them, loaded with implication, but stopping just short of an actual declaration. Margaret understood that Thomas was asking her to guide him toward a decision that would affect both their futures, But she also understood that the rules of proper courtship prevented her from being too direct in her response.
A person should make such decisions based on their own best interests, she said carefully, though her heart was racing with hope and fear in equal measure. And if a person's best interests have become connected to the happiness of someone else, Thomas asked, his voice so gentle that Margaret had to strain to hear it over the sound of her own pulse. Then perhaps, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, that person should consider whether their presence would contribute to that someone else's happiness as well. Thomas stepped closer, close enough that Margaret could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested he was as nervous as she felt. "Margaret," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth, more precious, more significant. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I need you to understand that these weeks in Millbrook have changed something fundamental about how I see my future." "Changed it how?" Margaret asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "I used to think that success meant advancement, moving to bigger cities and more important positions. But now I find myself thinking that success might mean finding the right person to build a life with, even if that life is smaller and quieter than what I had originally planned." Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes, though whether from joy or sorrow she couldn't say. "And the Chicago position? The opportunity for advancement you spoke of?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had wrestled with a difficult decision and finally reached a conclusion. "The Chicago position represents everything I thought I wanted when I was younger and less wise. Better pay, more prestigious work, connections that could lead to even greater opportunities. But it would also mean leaving behind the one thing that has given my life real meaning for the first time in 26 years. "Thomas," Margaret whispered, his name carrying all the hope and fear and desperate love that she had been trying to contain for weeks. "I'm going to turn down the Chicago offer," he said with quiet firmness. "I'm going to accept the Albany position and ask your father for permission to court you officially. That is, if you think such courtship might be welcome." Margaret's answer was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching on the wooden sidewalk. They stepped apart quickly, assuming the proper distance expected of unmarried people in public, but Margaret's radiant smile would have told any observer exactly what kind of conversation had just taken place. But fate, it seemed, had different plans for Thomas Cartwright's carefully laid intentions. The next morning brought a telegram that would change everything, though none of us understood its significance at the time. I was sweeping the front steps when the telegraph boy arrived, his bicycle clattering to a stop outside our store with the urgent haste that always accompanied important communications. Thomas emerged from the back room where he had been counting grain sacks, and I saw his expression change as he recognized the official railroad envelope the boy carried. "Thomas Cartwright?" the boy asked, consulting the address written in his careful script. "That's me," Thomas replied, accepting the telegram with hands that were notably steady despite the circumstances. In 1903, unexpected telegrams rarely brought good news, and everyone understood that railroad communications often concerned accidents, schedule changes, or employment decisions that could alter a man's life without warning. Thomas read the message silently, his expression growing more troubled with each line. Finally, he looked up at Father, who had emerged from behind the counter with the concerned expression of an employer who recognizes that his temporary help might be receiving news that would affect their business arrangement. "The Chicago position," Thomas said, carefully controlled. "They need me to start immediately, tomorrow, if possible. There's been some kind of problem with their current freight coordinator, and they're offering a substantial bonus for quick response." Father nodded slowly, understanding the implications. "How substantial?" Thomas showed him the telegram, and I saw Father's eyebrows rise slightly as he read the specific numbers mentioned. Even from my position by the door, I could see that whatever the railroad was offering, it represented considerably more money than Thomas could earn in any local position. "That's a generous offer," Father said carefully. "The kind of opportunity that doesn't come along often." "Yes," Thomas agreed, but his voice carried no enthusiasm whatsoever. "It is." Margaret, who had been listening to this exchange from her desk near the window, finally spoke up. "And will you accept it?" Thomas turned to look at her, and I could see the conflict written clearly across his face, the struggle between practical opportunity and personal desire, between the security that money could provide and the happiness he had found in our small town. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Yesterday, the answer would have been simple, but circumstances have evolved since yesterday."
That evening brought one of those perfect October nights that seemed designed to break hearts. Clear and cool, with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and a moon that cast silver light over familiar landscapes, making them appear both beautiful and somehow final, like scenes from a beloved story that was approaching its conclusion. Thomas had asked Margaret to walk with him one more time to their special place on the hill, and she had agreed with the quiet composure of someone who sensed that her life was about to change irrevocably. I watched them leave from the kitchen window, noting how they walked more slowly than usual, as if they were reluctant to reach their destination and the conversation that awaited them there. I waited 20 minutes, then followed at a careful distance. The moon was bright enough to make stealth unnecessary, but still allowed me to remain hidden behind the old apple tree that had served as my observation post for their previous intimate conversations. They sat on the low stone wall that was all that remained of the old farmhouse, Margaret's blue dress dark against the pale stones, Thomas's profile sharp in the moonlight. For several minutes, they sat in the kind of comfortable silence that speaks of deep understanding between two people who have learned to communicate as much through shared quiet as through words. Finally, Thomas spoke, and his voice carried across the still evening air with perfect clarity. "The railroad is offering me $1,200 a year, plus bonuses for efficient operations," he said without preamble. "It's more money than I've ever imagined earning, Margaret. With that kind of salary, I could save enough in 2 years to buy a house, to establish myself properly before—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to complete the thought aloud. "What before?" Margaret asked gently. Thomas stood and walked a few steps away from the wall, his back to Margaret, his shoulders tense with the weight of the decision he was struggling to make. When he turned back to face her, even from my hiding place behind the apple tree, I could see the pain in his posture. "Before I could ask you to marry me," he said simply. "Before I could offer you the kind of life you deserve, security, comfort, a home worthy of the woman you are."
Margaret was quiet for so long that I began to worry she might not respond at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with emotion. "And what kind of life do you think I deserve, Thomas?" "Better than what I can offer you now," he replied immediately. "You're educated, accomplished, beautiful. You could marry any man in this county, men with established businesses, inherited property, guaranteed futures. You shouldn't have to settle for a railroad worker who owns nothing but the clothes on his back and a head full of dreams that might never materialize."
Margaret rose from the stone wall and walked toward him, her movements graceful despite the uneven ground. In the moonlight, she looked ethereal, almost ghost-like, and I found myself holding my breath as I watched the most important conversation of their lives unfold. "Thomas Cartwright," she said, and there was something in her voice, a combination of tenderness and exasperation that made her sound older and wiser than her 20 years. "Do you seriously believe that what I want from life is a man with established property and guaranteed comfort?" "I believe," Thomas replied carefully, "that you deserve to have choices, that you shouldn't have to give up your dreams of teaching, of independence, of seeing the world beyond Millbrook, just because you've developed feelings for a temporary worker who might not be able to provide for you properly." Margaret stepped closer, close enough now that she could have touched him if she had chosen to. "And what if my dreams have changed? What if I've discovered that the life I thought I wanted isn't the life I actually want?" Thomas looked down at her with an expression of such naked hope and fear that it was almost painful to witness. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger with each word, "that I would rather live in a one-room apartment with a man who loves me truly than in a mansion with someone who sees me only as a beautiful ornament for his established life. I'm saying that I would rather teach in a one-room schoolhouse in whatever town you're working in than accept a position at the finest academy in Albany if it meant we could be together." "Margaret," Thomas whispered, and her name sounded like a prayer. "But I'm also saying," she continued, holding up a hand to prevent him from interrupting, "that if you truly believe this Chicago opportunity is what's best for your future, for our future, then you should take it. I won't be the reason you sacrifice your chance for advancement." Thomas closed the distance between them then, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that spoke of reverence rather than passion. "The only future I can imagine wanting is one that includes you," he said with quiet intensity. "But I also can't bear the thought of asking you to wait indefinitely while I try to establish myself sufficiently to deserve you." "Then don't ask me to wait indefinitely," Margaret said simply. "Give me something more definite to wait for."
What happened next was the moment that would define the rest of Margaret's life, though none of us fully understood its significance at the time. Thomas released her hands and reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing the small wrapped package that contained his mother's locket, the one I knew Margaret already wore, though I pretended surprise when she showed it to me the following morning. "This belonged to my mother," he said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "She gave it to me just before she died, told me to keep it safe until I found a woman worthy of wearing it."
Margaret accepted the package with trembling fingers, unwrapping it to reveal the silver locket that caught moonlight on its engraved surface like captured starlight. "I know we've only known each other 2 months," Thomas continued, his words coming faster now, as if he were afraid he might lose his courage if he paused. "But Margaret, I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I don't believe I ever will again." He took the locket from her hands and stepped behind her to fasten it around her neck, his fingers gentle at the nape of her neck as he worked the delicate clasp. "I have to take this position in Chicago. The money is too good to refuse, and it will allow me to save enough to offer you a proper future. But if you'll accept this locket as a token of my intentions, if you'll wear it as a symbol of my promise to return, then I swear to you on my mother's memory that I will be back before the first snow falls." Margaret's hand rose to touch the locket at her throat, her fingers tracing its engraved surface as if memorizing its weight and texture. "Before the first snow," she repeated, softly. "Before the first snow," Thomas confirmed, turning her to face him. "And when I return, I'll have enough saved to rent a proper house, to ask your father formally for your hand, to offer you the kind of wedding and married life that befits a woman of your quality." Margaret looked up into his face, her own expression serene despite the tears that sparkled on her cheeks in the moonlight. "I'll wait," she said, simply. "However long it takes, I'll wait."
Thomas cupped her face in his hands then, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. "It won't be long," he promised. 3 months at most. I'll work every available hour, save every penny I can spare. By Thanksgiving, I'll have enough set aside to come back and make you my wife properly." "Before the first snow," Margaret repeated, and the words sounded like a vow. They stood together in the moonlight for several more minutes, holding each other with the desperate tenderness of people who know they are about to be separated. Finally, reluctantly, they began the walk back to town, moving slowly as if they could somehow delay the approaching moment of goodbye. I remained hidden behind the apple tree until they had disappeared down the hill, my head spinning with the magnitude of what I had witnessed. Thomas Cartwright had just promised to marry my sister, and Margaret had accepted that promise with a faith that seemed both touching and slightly frightening in its completeness. More than that, he had given her his mother's locket, a gesture that represented not just romantic commitment, but the transfer of family history, the inclusion of Margaret in the most precious memories of his past. It was a promise that went beyond mere words, anchored in silver and memory and the weight of maternal blessing.
Thomas's final day in Millbrook dawned gray and cold, with the kind of sharp October air that carries hints of the winter to come. There had been frost during the night, not heavy enough to kill the late flowers, but sufficient to silver the grass and remind everyone that the season was turning inexorably toward its conclusion. He spent the morning completing his final reports and organizing his materials for whoever would take over his remaining responsibilities. Father had decided not to hire a replacement immediately. The seasonal work was nearly finished, and the expense of training someone new wasn't justified for the few tasks that remained. Margaret worked at her desk with unusual concentration, her pen moving steadily across the columns of figures in her ledger, but I noticed that she looked up every time Thomas moved through the store, her eyes following him as if she were trying to memorize his every gesture and expression. The afternoon brought a succession of farewell visits as Thomas made his rounds through town. He stopped at the church to thank Reverend Patterson for welcoming him to Sunday services. He visited Mrs. Morrison, whose arthritis he had helped by carrying her heavy packages and chopping kindling for her stove. He even spent time at the schoolhouse, where Miss Bradley thanked him for the mechanical drawings he had made to help her students understand how locomotives worked. Each visit was brief but meaningful, and by evening Thomas had touched base with everyone in Millbrook who had shown him kindness during his stay. It was the behavior of a man who understood the importance of proper goodbyes, who wanted to leave no relationships incomplete or obligations unfulfilled.
The family dinner that final evening was both celebration and wake. Mother had prepared Thomas's favorite foods, but the meal was suffused with the melancholy that accompanies all significant partings. We ate slowly, as if by prolonging the meal we could postpone the approaching separation, but eventually even Mother's apple pie was finished, and the dishes had been cleared away. Thomas presented Father with a detailed summary of the store's inventory and seasonal patterns, along with recommendations for future improvements. He gave Mother a small potted plant he had purchased from the traveling nurseryman, a cutting of rosemary that he said would remind her of the herb garden his own mother had tended. For me, he had found a book of adventure stories that he thought might appeal to a 16-year-old boy with curiosity about the wider world. But for Margaret, he had no tangible gift beyond the locket she already wore. Instead, he offered something more precious, a private conversation on the front porch while the rest of us busied ourselves with evening tasks that could have waited but provided a polite excuse for privacy. I watched from the kitchen window as they stood together in the lamplight from the porch fixture, their heads bent in intimate conversation. Margaret's hands were clasped in front of her, her posture erect but somehow fragile, like a flower stem that might bend under too much weight. Thomas stood slightly closer than strict propriety would have dictated, his own posture protective and tender.
After 20 minutes, they returned to the parlor, where the rest of us waited with the careful composure people adopt when trying not to intrude on private emotions. Margaret's eyes were bright, but her smile was steady. Thomas moved with the controlled precision of a man who has made his farewells and is ready to face whatever comes next. He shook hands with Father, the gesture formal but warm. "Thank you for the opportunity," he said simply. "Working here has meant more to me than you can know." Father gripped his hand firmly. "You're a good man, Thomas. I hope Chicago appreciates what they're getting." He kissed Mother's cheek with the respectful affection of a son, and she pressed a paper-wrapped package into his hands. "Cookies for the journey," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "And a reminder that you'll always have friends in Millbrook." When he turned to me, I felt suddenly, surprisingly emotional. Over the past 2 months, Thomas had become something like the older brother I had never had, patient with my questions, interested in my thoughts, willing to treat a 16-year-old boy as someone worth knowing rather than merely tolerating. "Take care of your sister while I'm gone," he said, quietly, ruffling my hair with casual affection. "She's going to need someone to remind her to eat properly and not work too hard." "I will," I promised, meaning it completely. Finally, inevitably, he turned to Margaret for their final goodbye. She rose from her chair with fluid grace, her hand unconsciously touching the locket beneath her dress. They stood facing each other in our familiar parlor, surrounded by all the domestic comforts of home, but somehow appearing isolated in their own private bubble of emotion. "Before the first snow," Thomas said, and his voice held all the certainty in the world. "I'll be waiting," Margaret replied, and I could see her touching the locket beneath her dress. He picked up his leather satchel, the same one he had carried when he first arrived in Millbrook 10 weeks earlier, and walked toward the door with steady steps. But at the threshold, he paused and turned back one final time. "Margaret," he said, and her name carried the weight of everything he couldn't say in front of her family. "Remember what I told you about dreams changing. Remember that the best futures are sometimes the ones we never planned." "I'll remember," she promised. And then he was gone, walking down the elm-lined street toward the center of town, his figure growing smaller in the lamplight until he disappeared around the corner that led to the train station. The 6:30 evening train would carry him on the first leg of his journey to Chicago, to the position that promised financial security and professional advancement, to the future he believed would allow him to return to Millbrook as a man worthy of Margaret's hand in marriage. We stood on the front porch until the sound of the departing train had faded into the distance, each of us lost in private thoughts about what this departure might mean. Margaret remained outside longest of all, her slim figure motionless in the cooling air, her face turned toward the south, where the railroad tracks carried both departing dreams and returning hopes.
When she finally came inside, her expression was calm, but her eyes held a look I had never seen before. The expression of someone who has wagered everything on a single promise and must now wait to see if that gamble will prove wise or foolish. "First snow usually comes by Thanksgiving," she said to no one in particular as she locked the front door. "Sometimes earlier if it's been a cold autumn." She had 7 weeks to wait. 7 weeks that would stretch into months and then into years before we would learn the true cost of Thomas Cartwright's promise and the full measure of Margaret's faith.
The letters began arriving with the punctuality that had characterized everything about Thomas Cartwright's nature. Exactly 1 week after his departure, Margaret received the first envelope, her name written in Thomas's precise handwriting on cream-colored paper that still carried the faint scent of the tobacco he occasionally smoked. She read it alone first, standing by her bedroom window in the morning light, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the pages. Then, at breakfast, she shared selected passages with the family, her voice steady but softer than usual, always preserving the most intimate words for herself alone. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, I arrived safely in Chicago yesterday after a journey that gave me ample time to think about everything I left behind in Millbrook. The city is vast beyond description. Buildings that seem to scrape the very clouds, streets filled with carriages and those new horseless automobiles. People from every corner of the world speaking languages I cannot identify. But for all its wonders, Chicago feels hollow without the warmth of familiar faces. My room at Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house on Halsted Street is adequate but cold. Clean linens and a window facing east, which I tell myself points toward home, toward you. Each morning when I wake, I spend the first few minutes imagining what you might be doing at that very moment. Are you humming while you arrange the store's inventory? Are you wearing the blue dress that makes your eyes look like summer skies? Are you touching the locket and thinking of me as I think of you with every breath I take? The work here is demanding but manageable. I am coordinating freight operations for grain shipments and manufactured goods, supervising teams of men who load the cars that carry commerce to every corner of the nation. The wages are indeed excellent, better than I dared hope. At this rate, I will be able to save enough to return to Millbrook not as a temporary worker seeking employment, but as a man with genuine prospects and money in the bank. Please give my regards to your parents and tell that rascal a brother of yours I still owe him a rematch at checkers. Kiss your mother's cheek for me and tell her I think of her rosemary cutting every time I smell herbs cooking in the boarding house kitchen. Most of all, remember that I count each day until I can see your beautiful face again. The first snow cannot come soon enough because it will mark my return to the only place that has ever felt like home.
Margaret folded the letter carefully after reading the appropriate portions aloud, but I noticed she returned to it several times throughout the day, rereading passages privately when she thought no one was watching. The paper became soft with handling, and she began carrying it in her apron pocket, where it would remain close to her heart. "He sounds well settled," Father observed approvingly. "Railroad work in Chicago is steady employment. If he can establish himself as he claims, he'll be able to provide well for a wife. When he returns," Mother added with pointed emphasis, "railroad men make promises easily, Margaret. It's the keeping of them that counts." But Margaret's confidence never wavered. "Thomas will keep his promise," she said, with quiet certainty. "He's not the kind of man who speaks words he doesn't mean."
The second letter arrived exactly 1 week later, maintaining the precise schedule Thomas had established. This one was shorter, but equally warm, filled with detailed observations about his work and careful questions about life in Millbrook that revealed how thoroughly he had woven himself into the fabric of our daily existence. "Tell me about the maple tree outside your bedroom window," he wrote. "Has it finished turning, or are there still green leaves clinging to the highest branches? I remember how you mentioned that it was always the last tree on Elm Street to surrender completely to autumn. And how is Mrs. Morrison's arthritis as the weather grows colder? Please give her my regards and tell her I still remember her advice about checking the grain shipments for moisture damage. Her years of experience taught me more in one conversation than some men learn in a lifetime of work. I think often of our evening walks along Miller's Creek. The Chicago River runs through this city, but it's brown with industrial waste and smells of commerce rather than the clean, sweet scent of water running over stones worn smooth by centuries of current. I close my eyes sometimes and try to remember the sound of that creek, the way moonlight looked on its surface when we sat on the old foundation talking about books and dreams and the shape of the future we might build together. Margaret answered each letter immediately, writing long responses that chronicled every detail of her days with the precision of someone creating a record for an absent beloved. She told him about customers who asked after him, about changes in the weather and the progression of autumn colors, about small domestic projects and the books she was reading. Her letters, which I occasionally glimpsed as she sealed them, were models of proper correspondence, warm but not overly familiar, newsy but never trivial, expressing affection while maintaining the dignity expected of a respectable young woman. But I noticed that she always ended with the same phrase: "I remain, as always, faithfully yours." The third letter, arriving in early November, carried the first hint of concern, though Thomas tried to disguise it behind optimistic language about expanded opportunities.
The railroad has asked me to take on additional responsibilities, he wrote, coordinating not just local shipments, but connections with multiple railway lines throughout the Midwest. It's more complex work than I originally expected, involving schedules and logistics that spans several states. The additional duties mean longer hours, but also substantially better compensation. What I thought might take 3 months to save, I may now accomplish in 2. Every extra hour I work, every additional responsibility I accept, brings me one step closer to returning to Millbrook with enough money to offer you the kind of future you deserve. Do not worry, my beloved, for I am more determined than ever to keep my promise. The work is demanding, but I am young and strong, and I carry the thought of you with me through every difficult day. I will be home before the first snow, even if I must walk every mile from Chicago to Millbrook to honor that vow. Margaret read this letter aloud to the family, but her voice carried a subtle tension that hadn't been present before. After dinner, I found her standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the maple tree whose branches were now nearly bare, except for a few stubborn leaves that clung despite the increasingly cold winds. "Worried?" I asked, joining her at the window. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers unconsciously touching the locket beneath her dress. "Not worried exactly," she said finally, "but aware. Aware that good intentions can be complicated by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Thomas isn't the kind of man who breaks his word," I said, echoing her own earlier certainty. "No," Margaret agreed softly, "but sometimes the world breaks promises for us, regardless of our intentions."
The fourth letter was delayed by nearly 2 weeks, and when it finally arrived, it was noticeably shorter and written in handwriting that seemed less controlled than Thomas's usual precise script. Margaret carried this letter in her apron pocket for 3 days before sharing any of it with the family. "Forgive the delay in writing," Thomas had penned. "The work here has intensified beyond what anyone anticipated. We are handling winter shipping schedules while dealing with equipment problems and weather delays,
that can disrupt operations for days at a time. I find myself working from dawn until well past dark most days, supervising operations that require constant attention to detail. The pay is excellent, better than I had dared hope, but the hours are taking their toll. I feel tired more often than I should, and I've developed a persistent cough that the Chicago winter doesn't seem inclined to cure. But please don't worry about me. I am young and healthy, and this temporary exhaustion will pass once the worst of the winter shipping season is behind us. Every dollar I earn, every hour I invest, brings us closer to the future we plan together on that moonlit hill overlooking Millbrook. I dream of you every night, Margaret. I dream of your smile, your voice humming Irish melodies while you work, the way afternoon sunlight falls across your desk in the store. These dreams sustain me through the longest days and give me strength to continue when the work seems overwhelming. I will be home before the first snow, my darling. Nothing in this world will prevent me from keeping my word to you. When Margaret finally read selected portions of this letter at dinner, I noticed that she had chosen only the most optimistic passages, leaving out Thomas's mentions of fatigue and the persistent cough that suggested his health might be suffering under the demands of his ambitious work schedule. "He pushes himself too hard," she said, after folding the letter away. "I worry that he's sacrificing his health for financial gain." Father, who understood the pressures of building a business, nodded sympathetically. Ambitious young men often do, but it speaks well of his character that he's willing to work hard for your future together. But Mother watched Margaret with the sharp attention of someone who recognizes the signs of growing anxiety. "Perhaps you should write and suggest that he take better care of himself. Money is important, but not at the expense of health." Margaret nodded, but I could see in her expression that she was already mentally composing a letter that would somehow balance encouragement with gentle concern, support for his ambitions with worry for his well-being. November progressed with agonizing slowness. Margaret developed new routines that revolved entirely around Thomas's absence. Daily walks past the post office to check for mail, morning consultations of the almanac to monitor weather predictions, evening sessions at her desk, writing letters that grew longer and more detailed, as if she could bridge the distance between Chicago and Millbrook through sheer volume of words. She also intensified her domestic preparations with an energy that seemed to increase in direct proportion to her growing anxiety. Every spare moment was devoted to embroidering pillowcases, hemming dish towels, practicing elaborate recipes from ladies' magazines. The hope chest in her bedroom began to fill with the accumulated treasures of anticipated married life. Linens embroidered with her initials intertwined with Thomas's, recipes carefully copied from Mother's collection, even a small silver spoon that she said would be perfect for serving honey in their future home. "If I keep myself busy," she confided to me one evening as we sat by the parlor fire, "then I don't have time to worry about things I cannot control." But the worry was there nonetheless, visible in the way she paused mid-stitch whenever a train whistle sounded in the distance, in how she counted and recounted the days until Thanksgiving in the margins of her letters, in the increasing frequency with which her hand rose unconsciously to touch the locket at her throat. The weather seemed to conspire against her peace of mind. November brought unusual cold, with frost appearing nightly and a bitter wind that stripped the last leaves from the elm trees weeks earlier than normal. Margaret began checking the almanac obsessively, looking for predictions about when the first significant snowfall might be expected. The almanac says first snow usually comes in early December, she would announce at breakfast, as if repetition might somehow make the prediction more reliable. Sometimes late November if it's been particularly cold, but early December is more typical. Father began making gentle suggestions about the uncertainty of weather predictions and the advisability of maintaining flexibility about timing. But Margaret would simply nod and return to her almanac, counting days like a mathematician working an equation that must somehow produce the desired result.
The first snow came on November 28th, 1903, a date that would be forever etched in our family's memory like a wound that never quite healed. I woke that morning to a world transformed beyond recognition. During the night, winter had arrived with decisive authority, blanketing Millbrook in 4 inches of clean, white silence that muffled every familiar sound and softened every sharp edge into gentle curves. The bare branches of the elm trees wore caps of snow. The fence posts had grown fat with white cushions, and the air carried that peculiar stillness that comes only with winter's first serious announcement of its presence. Margaret was already awake when I came downstairs for breakfast. She stood at the kitchen window in her nightgown and shawl, staring out at the transformed landscape with an expression of such concentrated listening that I wondered if she expected to hear Thomas's footsteps approaching through the snow. "It's early this year," she said without turning around, her voice carefully neutral. "The almanac said first snow usually doesn't come until December." Mother, who was making coffee at the stove, glanced at Margaret with concern. "Weather doesn't always follow predictions, dear. Sometimes winter comes early, sometimes late. It doesn't necessarily mean anything." But we all knew it meant everything. Thomas Cartwright had promised to return before the first snow, and the first snow had arrived without any sign of Thomas. Margaret dressed with unusual care that morning, wearing her best blue dress and taking extra time with her hair. She pinned the silver locket prominently at her throat, where it caught the light from the snow-brightened windows and seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart. "He might still come today," she said as we walked to the store together, our boots crunching through the fresh snow with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the muffled landscape. "The morning train from Albany doesn't arrive until 8:47. There's still time." I wanted to agree with her, wanted to share her optimism, but something in the quality of the snowfall, the way it had fallen so heavily and completely during the night, suggested that winter had settled in for a long stay. At 8:47, we heard the train whistle as the morning locomotive pulled into the station, its sound different in the snow-muffled air, more distant, more mournful. Margaret stopped her bookkeeping and stood very still, listening to the familiar sounds of arrival and departure. When no footsteps approached the store, when no familiar voice called out a greeting, she returned to her ledger with a composure that was heartbreaking in its perfect dignity. "Perhaps the evening train," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. But Thomas Cartwright was not on the evening train either, nor on any of the trains that arrived in the following days. The snow that had fallen on November 28th remained on the ground,
growing deeper with each subsequent storm, transforming Millbrook into a winter wonderland that should have been shared with the man who had promised to return before its arrival.
December passed in a strange suspension between hope and growing dread. Margaret maintained her routines with mechanical precision, opening the store each morning, serving customers with her usual efficiency, writing letters to Thomas despite the growing gap since his last response. But underneath her composed exterior, the strain began to show in small ways that only family members would notice. She lost weight, though she tried to hide it by taking in her dresses to fit more snugly. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, evidence of nights spent lying awake, listening for sounds that never came. Most tellingly, she began to withdraw from social interactions, declining invitations to church socials and neighborhood gatherings, where well-meaning friends might ask questions she couldn't answer. "Something's happened to him," she said to me one evening in mid-December as we sat by the parlor fire while snow fell steadily outside the windows. Thomas wouldn't break his word unless something had prevented him from keeping it. Father, who had grown increasingly concerned about Margaret's state of mind, suggested gently that perhaps Thomas had simply been offered an opportunity too good to refuse. "It happens, Margaret," he said, with the careful tone people use when delivering unwelcome possibilities. "Young men get caught up in new opportunities, new environments. Chicago is a big city with many attractions." But Margaret shook her head with fierce determination. "You don't know him the way I do. Thomas keeps his promises. If he's not here, it's because something terrible has happened to prevent his return." Mother tried a different approach, emphasizing practical concerns over romantic ones. "Even if Thomas has simply been delayed by work obligations," she said gently, "you cannot put your entire life on hold indefinitely. You're young, Margaret. There will be other opportunities for happiness." "I made a promise too," Margaret replied with quiet firmness. "I promised to wait for him, and I intend to keep that promise until I know definitively what has become of him." As winter deepened, Margaret began making active inquiries about Thomas's whereabouts. She wrote letters to the railroad office in Chicago, to Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house, to hospitals and police departments in every city between Chicago and Millbrook. The responses, when they came at all, were frustratingly vague and contradictory. The railroad confirmed that Thomas Cartwright had been employed through mid-November, but offered no information about his subsequent whereabouts, citing company policy about employee privacy. Mrs. O'Malley wrote that Thomas had paid his rent through the end of November and had mentioned traveling, but knew no details about his destination or plans. These fragments of information only deepened the mystery. Thomas had apparently left Chicago voluntarily, presumably to return to Millbrook as promised, but he had never arrived, and no one seemed to know what had become of him during the journey. Most cruelly of all, Margaret received several letters from confidence men who claimed to have information about Thomas, but demanded money before they would reveal what they knew. Father helped her identify these fraudulent correspondences, but each false lead was another small wound to her hopes.
Through it all, Margaret never stopped wearing Thomas's mother's locket. It had become such a part of her appearance that seeing her without it would have been as shocking as seeing her improperly dressed. The silver acquired a soft patina from constant wear, and the engraving of oak leaves grew smooth under her unconscious, caressing fingers.
Spring arrived in 1904 with unusual suddenness, as if nature were apologizing for the severity of the winter. Snow melted in rushing torrents. The creek behind the cemetery swelled to twice its normal size, and Margaret's garden erupted in daffodils and crocuses that had been planted the previous autumn in anticipation of sharing them with Thomas. Margaret greeted the changing season with renewed energy, as if warmer weather might somehow bring word of Thomas's fate. She expanded her inquiries, placed notices in newspapers, offered rewards for reliable information. But as weeks passed without any meaningful response, even her determined optimism began to show signs of strain. By summer, people in Millbrook had begun to whisper that Margaret Whitmore was wasting her youth on a futile hope. She was 21 now, an age when most women of her station were either married or actively being courted. Several eligible men had expressed interest in calling on her, but she declined each invitation with polite finality. "I am not available for courtship," she would say, her hand invariably rising to touch the locket at her throat. "I am waiting for someone." Some people admired Margaret's loyalty, viewing it as evidence of a faithful heart worthy of respect. Others considered it foolish stubbornness, a refusal to accept obvious reality. A few, less charitably, suggested that Margaret was using Thomas's disappearance as an excuse to avoid the normal obligations of womanhood. Margaret heard the whispers, of course, but rather than defending herself or offering explanations, she simply continued her routines with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed.
The truth came to Millbrook on a Tuesday morning in September of 1907, exactly 4 years after Thomas had left town with his promise to return before the first snow. It arrived not with dramatic fanfare, but in the form of a weathered man in his 50s who walked into Father's store and asked directions to the local cemetery. I was helping Margaret sort the morning's inventory when the stranger entered, removing his hat and nodding politely to both of us. He had the rough hands and sun-weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors, but his clothes were neat and his manner respectful. "Pardon me," he said to Father, "but I'm looking for information about burial plots in your cemetery. I'm trying to locate a grave, but I've lost track of exactly when the burial took place." Father looked up from his account books with the helpful expression he reserved for customers with legitimate needs. "I might be able to help. What name are you looking for?" "My nephew," the stranger replied, his voice carrying the weight of long-delayed grief. "Thomas Cartwright was his name. I believe he died somewhere in this area a few years back, but the family lost touch with the exact details during some difficult times of our own."
Margaret went completely still. The bolt of fabric she had been measuring slipped from her hands and rolled across the floor, unspooling yards of blue cotton that pooled around her feet like still water. The color drained from her face so completely that I feared she might faint, and her hand flew to her throat where Thomas's locket lay hidden beneath her dress. Father glanced quickly at Margaret, then back at the stranger, his expression suddenly grave. "Thomas Cartwright?" he repeated carefully. "Yes, I knew him. He worked here one harvest season, back in 1903, but he didn't die in Millbrook, sir. He left town in October of that year, heading for Chicago." The older man nodded gravely, his weathered face creasing with sorrow. "That's right. He made it to Chicago, worked there for about 2 months. But then he took sick. Pneumonia, the doctors said. Happened fast, the way it sometimes does with young, healthy men who push themselves too hard." Margaret made a sound then, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, but something that contained elements of both relief and devastation. Her legs seemed to give out, and she sat down hard on the store's wooden floor among the scattered fabric, both hands pressed to her throat. "When?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The stranger looked at her with sudden understanding, his eyes taking in her pale face, her obvious distress, the scattered fabric around her feet. "November 15th, 1903, he said gently. "He was buried in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. I'm sorry, did you know my nephew well?" November 15th, 2 weeks before the first snow had fallen on Millbrook. 2 weeks before the deadline Thomas had set for his promised return. For 4 years, Margaret had been waiting for a man who had died still trying to keep his word to her. Father helped Margaret to her feet and led her to the chair behind the counter, where she sat in stunned silence while the stranger, who introduced himself as Mr. William Cartwright from Buffalo, explained the circumstances of his nephew's death. Thomas had been working extremely long hours in the Chicago rail yards, determined to save enough money to return to Millbrook as quickly as possible. The work was physically demanding, and the approach of winter had brought additional pressures as the railroad struggled to maintain schedules despite increasingly harsh weather. In early November, Thomas had contracted what initially seemed to be a minor cold, but the infection had quickly progressed to pneumonia, complicated by his exhaustion and his refusal to take time away from work until he was too ill to continue. By the time he was confined to bed at Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house, the disease was beyond the power of 1903 medicine to cure. He was delirious toward the end, Mrs. O'Malley said. He kept talking about promises he needed to keep, about someone who was waiting for him. He mentioned a young woman's name, Margaret, I think it was. Margaret looked up sharply, tears streaming down her face. "He spoke of me." According to Mrs. O'Malley, he spoke of little else. Even when the fever was at its worst, he kept insisting that he had to get well, that he had promised to return to someone before the first snow fell. Mrs. O'Malley said she'd never seen a dying man fight so hard to recover, all for the sake of keeping a promise to someone he loved.
Mr. Cartwright reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope yellowed with age and soft with handling. Mrs. O'Malley saved his personal effects, thinking family might eventually come for them. Most of it was just clothes and railroad documents, but she thought this might be important. It's a letter he was writing when he took sick, though he never finished it. Margaret took the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written on the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting, but the ink had an odd quality, some letters dark and firm, others pale and shaky, as if the writer's strength had been failing as he worked. Inside, she found 2 sheets of paper covered with Thomas's careful script.
I could see from my position that the handwriting deteriorated as the letter progressed, becoming increasingly difficult to read, until it ended abruptly mid-sentence in an illegible scrawl. Margaret read silently first, tears streaming down her face, but her expression growing lighter with each sentence. When she finished, she looked up at us with something approaching peace in her eyes for the first time in 4 years. "He was trying to keep his promise," she said softly, her voice wondering. "Right up until the end, he was making plans to return to Millbrook. He had saved enough money to rent a house, had arranged for time away from work. He was going to leave Chicago on November 20th, 5 days after he died." She held up the letter, and I could see that it ended mid-sentence, the final words trailing off into illegibility. "He wrote that he was feeling tired, but expected to recover soon. He said he carried my image with him always and counted the hours until he could see my face again. The last thing he wrote was, 'Tell Margaret that I will keep my promise, even if—'" And then it stops. Mr. Cartwright nodded sadly. Mrs. O'Malley said he was still making travel arrangements from his sickbed, right up until the fever took him completely. He never accepted that he might not recover, never stopped believing he would be strong enough to return to you. Because he had made a promise, Margaret said with quiet certainty, her voice stronger now. Thomas was the kind of man who kept his word, no matter what the cost.
The immediate effect of learning the truth about Thomas's death was transformative for Margaret, though not in the way any of us had expected. Rather than collapsing under the weight of confirmed loss, she seemed to grow stronger, as if a terrible uncertainty had finally been resolved, and she could begin to rebuild her life on solid ground. For 4 years, she had been tormented by not knowing whether Thomas had abandoned her deliberately or been prevented from returning by circumstances beyond his control. Now she knew that he had died still loving her, still planning their life together, still believing he would recover in time to keep his promise. That knowledge, paradoxically, gave her a peace she hadn't known since his departure. "He didn't break his word," she told me that evening, as we sat in the parlor where she had spent so many nights, waiting and wondering. Thomas kept his promise in every way that was humanly possible. Only death was powerful enough to prevent his return, and even death couldn't prevent him from trying until his last conscious moment. The knowledge changed Margaret's relationship with her grief entirely. Instead of the sharp, uncertain pain she had carried for years, she now had the clean sorrow of definitive loss, painful but pure, like a wound that could finally begin to heal properly because the source of infection had been removed. She continued to wear Thomas's mother's locket, but now it felt less like a token of waiting and more like a memorial to love that had been real and true, even if it had been cut short by forces beyond anyone's control. She continued to teach, but her work took on new meaning as she poured into her students the care and attention she had once planned to give to children of her own. Most surprisingly, Margaret began to speak openly about Thomas for the first time in years. She would tell her students stories about the young man who had worked in her father's store and taught her about distant places. She would mention to customers how Thomas had shown her better ways to arrange merchandise or serve difficult patrons. His memory became a living part of her present, rather than a painful secret she carried alone.
Margaret lived for another 39 years after learning the truth about Thomas's death, and those years were marked by a quiet contentment that surprised everyone who had known her during the long period of waiting. She never married, but she created a life of genuine purpose and deep satisfaction. She became Millbrook's most beloved teacher, educating 3 generations of children with patience, wisdom, and the kind of gentle authority that comes from having survived great loss with dignity intact. Her former students, grown to adulthood, would return to visit and seek her counsel on matters of love and loss, knowing that she understood something profound about both. She maintained a beautiful garden behind the family house, growing flowers and vegetables with the same meticulous care she brought to all her endeavors. Neighbors would often find small bouquets from Margaret's garden left anonymously on their doorsteps during times of illness or sorrow. Gifts from someone who understood the healing power of beauty freely given. Most remarkably, Margaret developed a reputation as a confidant for young couples facing obstacles to their happiness. She would listen without judgment as they described disapproving families, financial difficulties, or social barriers that seemed insurmountable. Her advice was always practical, but never cynical, helping lovers find ways to honor their commitments while accepting the limitations that life might impose. Love is not always rewarded with the life we plan, I once heard her tell a young woman whose fiancé had been called away to work in distant logging camps. But love itself is always worthwhile, regardless of its ultimate outcome. The capacity to love deeply is a gift, not a burden, and it should never be wasted or regretted.
Margaret died on an October evening in 1946, 43 years after Thomas Cartwright's departure and 39 years after learning the truth about his death. She was 63 years old, still teaching, still tending her garden, still wearing the silver locket that had traveled from Thomas's mother to Thomas to her. I was with her at the end, holding her hand while Dr. Mitchell spoke in quiet tones about weak hearts and lives well lived. As the sun set outside her bedroom window, casting the familiar elm-lined streets in golden light, Margaret's breathing grew shallow, but remained peaceful. "The locket," she whispered to me, her voice barely audible above the autumn wind rattling the windows. Make sure it goes with me. Thomas will be looking for it." I promised her it would, and I kept that promise just as she had kept hers. Margaret Whitmore was buried wearing Thomas Cartwright's mother's locket. The silver, now tarnished with age, but the engravings still clear. Oak leaves that had outlasted the tree they were carved to represent. Love that had outlasted the lives that contained it.
But Margaret left behind more than just memories. Hidden in her bedroom dresser, I found 23 letters. Letters she had written to Thomas over the years, but never sent. Each one sealed and dated and tied with the same faded blue ribbon I had found in the attic. Letters that chronicled her life as it unfolded without him, documenting 4 decades of teaching and gardening and small kindnesses, 4 decades of living fully while maintaining faith in a love that death had interrupted but not destroyed. Each letter ended with the same words, "I remain, as always, faithfully yours." I burned those letters the night after Margaret's funeral in the fireplace of the house where we had grown up together. Not because I thought they should be destroyed, but because I finally understood that they had served their purpose. For 39 years after learning of Thomas's death, Margaret had continued writing to him, keeping him alive in the only way she could, honoring both his promise to return and her promise to wait. Now, as I sit here in this empty house with winter approaching once again and my own hair gone white as fresh snow, I understand what Margaret understood all along. Some promises are kept not in their fulfillment, but in the keeping of them. Thomas Cartwright promised to return before the first snow, and in the most important way, he did return. In every autumn Margaret spent remembering their walks together. In every winter she spent wearing his mother's locket. In every spring that reminded her of the garden they had planned to tend as husband and wife. She promised to wait for him, and she waited. Not for his physical return. She was too intelligent to believe in impossibilities after learning of his death, but for the completion of their story, for the moment when waiting itself would become unnecessary, and she could join him wherever faithful hearts are finally reunited with their promised loves. Margaret Whitmore waited until the last leaves fell in October of 1946, and then she let herself go to whatever place exists beyond time and loss and unfulfilled promises. In my dreams, I like to imagine her arriving at whatever station serves eternity, stepping down from the train to find Thomas Cartwright waiting on the platform with that leather satchel in one hand and a perfectly reasonable explanation for his delay on his lips. And I imagine her smiling that smile I remembered from when we were children, the one that said she had never doubted, not for a single moment, that this was exactly how their story was meant to end. Some promises, after all, are worth a lifetime of keeping. And some love stories are so beautiful that they can only be completed in the country beyond time, where first snows never fall too early, and promises are measured not in seasons, but in the faithfulness that sustains them, where Thomas Cartwright still carries his mother's locket in his heart, and Margaret Whitmore still wears it over hers, and the distance between a promise made and a promise kept is finally, perfectly, eternally closed.
I found Margaret's letters last Tuesday while cleaning out the attic of the old Whitmore house. 64 years had passed since I last saw her handwriting, but I recognized it immediately. Those careful, slanted letters she'd practiced so diligently when we were children, back when she dreamed of becoming a school teacher, before life had other plans for her. The letters were tied with a faded blue ribbon, the same shade as the dress she wore that September morning in 1903, when Thomas Cartwright promised to return before the first snow. I was 16 then, Margaret's younger brother by 2 years, and I thought I understood everything about love and promises. Now, at 80, holding those letters in hands spotted with age and trembling with more than just the morning chill, I realize I understood nothing at all. But Margaret understood everything. She understood that some promises are meant to be kept, even when the one who made them can no longer remember why they mattered. She understood that waiting isn't passive, it's the most active thing a heart can do. And she understood long before the rest of us that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that end exactly as they were meant to end, even when that ending breaks every heart that witnesses it. The house is empty now, has been for 21 years since Margaret passed. But as I sit here in the parlor where she spent so many evenings with her needlework, watching the afternoon light slant through windows she cleaned every Saturday morning without fail, I can almost hear the echo of her humming. Those Irish melodies our grandmother taught her, songs that seemed to carry the weight of old sorrows and older hopes. The scent of lavender still lingers in the fabric of the curtains she sewed, and her tea service sits exactly where she left it, the delicate china cups still stained with the memory of countless afternoons spent in quiet contemplation. When I touch the lace doilies she crocheted during those long winter evenings of waiting, I can feel the pattern of her patience worked into every careful stitch.
Reading through those 23 letters she wrote but never sent, chronicling 43 years of life lived in the shadow and light of a promise kept, I'm struck by how wrong we all were about Margaret's waiting. We saw it as tragedy, as a waste of youth and possibility, as stubborn refusal to accept reality and move forward with her life. But Margaret wasn't stuck in the past. She was living fully in each present moment while holding space for a love that had been real, true, and worthy of remembrance. She was teaching children who would grow up to become teachers themselves, passing on not just arithmetic and reading, but lessons about loyalty, dignity, and the kinds of love that endure beyond circumstance. She was tending a garden that fed half the neighborhood, leaving anonymous bouquets on doorsteps during times of sorrow, listening to the troubles of young couples with the wisdom of someone who understood both the fragility and the resilience of the human heart. She was writing letters to a dead man, not from delusion or inability to accept loss, but from a deep understanding that love doesn't end with death, that the conversation between hearts continues across whatever barriers separate this world from the next.
Last autumn,
On what would have been Thomas and Margaret's 64th wedding anniversary, I made the journey to Chicago to visit Graceland Cemetery. It took me 3 days to locate Thomas Cartwright's grave, a simple stone marker in a section reserved for working men who died far from home, their stories known only to God and the few people who had loved them enough to remember. The caretaker, a kind man in his 50s, helped me find the plot and told me that in all his 20 years of service, he had never seen anyone visit this particular grave. No flowers, no mementos, he said sadly. Some of these old graves, it's like the people buried here have been completely forgotten. I knelt beside Thomas's grave and told him about Margaret, about how she had waited, how she had learned the truth of his death, how she had lived a full and meaningful life while never forgetting the love they had shared. I told him about her garden, her teaching, her quiet kindnesses to neighbors and strangers alike. Most importantly, I told him that she had kept her promise just as faithfully as he had tried to keep his. When I stood to leave, I noticed something that the caretaker had missed, a small indent in the soil near the headstone, as if someone had knelt there recently, perhaps leaving flowers that had since been cleared away. For a moment, my rational mind insisted it was probably just the result of maintenance work or the settling of the earth. But my heart, grown wise with 80 years of witnessing the inexplicable persistence of love, chose to believe otherwise.
Walking away from that cemetery in Chicago, I finally understood what Margaret had known all along, that Thomas Cartwright had kept his promise after all. Not in the way any of us expected, not by returning to Millbrook before the first snow of 1903, but by remaining so completely present in Margaret's heart and memory that she never felt truly alone or abandoned. His promise lived in every autumn walk she took along their favorite paths, remembering conversations they had shared. It lived in every Irish melody she hummed while working, carrying forward the joy he had brought into her life. It lived in every act of kindness she performed, motivated by the love he had awakened in her and the example of faithfulness he had set. Most mysteriously and beautifully, his promise lived in the 23 letters she wrote to him over the years, letters that chronicled not just her daily life, but her continued emotional connection to the man who had loved her completely in the brief time they had together. Margaret understood something that most people never learn, that true love doesn't require the physical presence of the beloved to remain real and transformative. Love like theirs creates its own weather system, its own seasons, its own time zone where promises exist outside the normal calculations of kept and broken.
The day after I returned from Chicago, I began going through Margaret's papers more systematically. In addition to the letters to Thomas, I found detailed journals spanning 40 years of teaching, containing not just lesson plans and student evaluations, but profound observations about human nature, learning, and the development of character. I found correspondence with former students who had sought her advice decades after leaving her classroom. Young women navigating difficult marriages, men struggling with career decisions, entire families seeking counsel during times of crisis. Margaret had become something like a secular saint in our community, someone people trusted with their deepest concerns, because they knew she understood both love and loss from the inside. I found records of her quiet, charitable activities, money sent anonymously to struggling families, school supplies purchased for children whose parents couldn't afford them, medical bills paid for elderly neighbors who thought their expenses had been forgiven by kindly doctors who didn't actually exist. Most touching of all, I found a collection of small objects that had belonged to Thomas during his brief time in Millbrook. A pencil he had used at the store, a bookmark he had left in a library volume, even a button that had fallen from his coat and which Margaret had saved for 64 years, as if it were a precious jewel.
These discoveries made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about my sister's life. What we had seen as tragic waiting was actually profound living, living with such depth and intentionality that she could extract meaning and beauty from even the most painful circumstances. Margaret had not wasted her life waiting for a man who would never return. She had spent her life honoring a love that was worthy of honor, while simultaneously building a legacy of service, kindness, and wisdom that would outlast her own mortal existence. She had kept Thomas alive not through delusion or refusal to accept reality, but through the kind of active remembrance that transforms grief into grace, loss into legacy, ending into beginning. Every child she taught carried forward something of the patience and gentleness that Thomas had awakened in her. Every couple she counseled benefited from the hard-won wisdom she had gained through loving completely and losing irretrievably. Every flower she planted, every kindness she performed, every moment of joy she created for others was a continuation of the love story that had begun in our family store in the autumn of 1903.
As I prepare to leave this house for the final time, it will be sold to a young family who will fill its rooms with new voices and new stories. I find myself thinking about the nature of promises and the various ways they can be kept. Thomas Cartwright promised to return before the first snow, and by any conventional measure, he failed to keep that promise. He died 2 weeks before his deadline, defeated by forces beyond his control or anticipation. But in a deeper sense, he kept his promise completely, not by returning in body, but by loving so genuinely and completely during their brief time together that Margaret carried his presence with her for the rest of her life. Margaret promised to wait for him, and she kept that promise in ways that transcended simple patience. She waited actively, productively, meaningfully, using the time of waiting to become the kind of person who was worthy of the love she had received and lost. She waited by living so fully and generously that her waiting became a gift to everyone whose life she touched. Their story teaches us that the most important promises are not measured in months or years, but in the depth of commitment they represent and the transformation they create in the lives of those who make them. Thomas and Margaret promised to love each other, and that promise was kept every day for 64 years, through separation and loss, through uncertainty and sorrow, through the long education in faithfulness that true love requires.
On my last night in this house, as I sit surrounded by the packed boxes containing Margaret's possessions and the remnants of our shared childhood, I allow myself to imagine their reunion in whatever place exists beyond the constraints of time and weather and human frailty. I see Thomas stepping down from a train that runs on schedules known only to eternity, carrying that same leather satchel he brought to Millbrook in 1903, his young face bright with anticipation and the particular joy of a promise finally, fully kept. I see Margaret waiting on the platform, wearing the blue dress he loved and the silver locket that connected them across 64 years of separation, her smile radiant with the vindication of faith maintained against all reasonable odds. I imagine their first words to each other, his apology for the delay, her gentle laughter at the very idea that such things matter in a place where time moves differently. I imagine them walking together along streets that are somehow both the elm-lined avenues of Millbrook and the golden pathways of whatever paradise rewards those who love truly and wait faithfully. Most of all, I imagine them finally having time, endless, unhurried time, to share all the conversations that were interrupted by his departure, to take all the walks that were cut short by circumstance, to tend the garden they planned, and raise the children they never had, and grow old together in the way that was stolen from them by tuberculosis and winter weather and the fragility of human flesh.
Tomorrow, the new owners will take possession of this house, and Margaret and Thomas's story will become part of its history, rather than its present reality. But stories like theirs don't really end when the last witness dies or the final artifact is packed away. They become part of the collective understanding of what love can be when it accepts no limitations, recognizes no obstacles, acknowledges no defeat. Somewhere in Millbrook, there are still descendants of the children Margaret taught, carrying forward the lessons she learned about loyalty and patience and the kinds of love that endure beyond reason. Somewhere there are still flowers blooming in gardens she influenced, still kindnesses being performed by people who learn generosity from her example. And somewhere, in the realm of stories that matter more than facts, Margaret Whitmore is still waiting for Thomas Cartwright, and Thomas Cartwright is still working frantically to return to her before the first snow, and their love is still teaching us that some promises are too important to be broken by anything as temporary as death. The first snow falls every year in Millbrook, just as it always has. But for those who understand Margaret and Thomas's story, it falls not as an ending, but as a beginning, the annual reminder that love like theirs creates its own seasons, keeps its own time, and fulfills its own promises in ways that transcend the small calculations of human understanding. In the country of the heart, it is always September 1903, and Thomas Cartwright is always walking down Main Street toward a destiny he could never have imagined, carrying a leather satchel and a future full of possibilities. Margaret Whitmore is always looking up from her ledger at the sound of the door chime, ready to receive the gift of a love that will define and sanctify the rest of her days. And somewhere, beyond the reach of clocks and calendars and the turning of seasons, the first snow is always just about to fall, and promises made in moonlight are always eternally, perfectly kept.